Last year, the world was fixated on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. The virus swept through Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, claiming more than 10,000 lives in the process and dominating global news.
Can Ebola be stopped? And is it too late to prevent it spreading even further?
Health officials have upped the death rate to 70%.
Infections will climb exponentially unless patients are isolated.
Then, once the emergency responders and volunteers got the disease somewhat under control, the media moved on. For many of us, Ebola is now an afterthought, even though the crisis exposed critical weaknesses in our ability to identify and prevent deadly outbreaks. So we sent Danny Gold back to West Africa to see what lessons were learned and whether those lessons have truly prepared us for whatever epidemic comes next.
So this is it right here. Most scientists believe that the bats that were in this tree were what started the entire Ebola outbreak that's been happening over the past year.
Bats are a known host of the virus. Scientists think that in December of 2013, a small boy named Emil came into contact with one of the bats that gather in the tree at dusk. Within a few days of getting sick, Emil passed away. We spoke with his father, Etienne.
Mi filome sala vele. Dole be solande fio. Di mai ahala balika lanu mungu yaba. Oba furi mi apango ngoma. Hokun nani mi sokuno hingi yabeje abandona pono. Ajo chiyo hokumbo mindu bevu.
This family's tragedy was the start of what would become a massive epidemic.
Manyenye pilan lanu bi Afrikondo. Mana kung duto vanda chiyon. Michani mana pura hundumu nao ma Ebola. Duto vanda chiyon.
Because Ebola had never been seen in the region before, it spread undetected, and similar deaths started occurring in other areas of the country. By the end of September, more than 7,000 cases of Ebola had been reported across West Africa, with nearly 50% of the cases proving fatal. In the fall of 2014, we went to Monrovia at the height of the outbreak in Liberia.
Sorry, sir. Are you okay? He clearly has the virus. Why can't we get him inside right now?
Everywhere's occupied.
Everywhere's occupied.
Our people are sick, people die every day. No good treatment, no good care.
Hospitals and treatment centers across the city were filled to capacity. Many people had nowhere to go and were left to die in the streets.
There's just a complete shortage of medical professionals, of healthcare facilities, of space to treat this disease. You know, this is what it is here. It's chaos.
The world's first Ebola epidemic has been horrific.
We spoke to Tom Frieden, the director of the Centers for Disease Control, about what went wrong.
The scenes in West Africa are scenes that those of us who worked there will never forget. Ebola had never been present there, and there weren't the systems in place in West Africa to have found this earlier.
Early on, Doctors Without Borders publicly described the outbreak as unprecedented, pleading with the international community for more help. The World Health Organization, tasked with handling these outbreaks, dismissed their warnings.
It's relatively small still. The biggest outbreaks have been over 400 cases.
They have since admitted to reacting too slowly. And without the proper medical infrastructure in place to fight the disease, Ebola continued to spread.
It spreads only by direct contact with someone who's sick or someone who's died or their body fluids. But as it gathered steam, we were not able to keep up, not from CDC, not globally, and certainly not from within the countries. They were not prepared. They didn't have the isolation capacity, they didn't have safe burial capacity, and they didn't have the awareness of Ebola. So this is the first time we've really seen these citywide, massive epidemics. We were not able to scale up a global response as quickly as we would have liked to.
In 2014, we saw firsthand as NGOs and a few brave Liberians were forced to take control in Monrovia. People like Archie Besse, a resident of the West Point neighborhood, were left with no choice but to organize their own efforts.
We are doing active case finding. That is, we are trying to locate all of the sick people. All of the ETU is failed. So what we are doing is to try to ensure that we engage the sick people at home.
So what can you do for her at this point?
Trying to ensure that while she's here, she can be getting some medicine to be taken. She can be getting some food to keep her strong.
And who's taking care of her? I mean, her daughter is young. She's here. Does she know not to touch her and not to touch?
Just got to know about it today.
Okay. You're taking a huge risk yourself by doing this.
I'm risking myself.
Yeah.
But remember now, if you find all of the sick people and you do nothing about it, it is even putting the community at more risk.
Ebola is extremely contagious in recently deceased victims, which makes every dead body a potential biohazard.
So you have to do this 10 times a day. I mean, does that affect your mind?
If we don't do it, who will do it?
It's pretty clear from seeing them in action that, these guys are taking tremendous risks, and they're heroes that are going to stop this infection from infecting, the entire community here.
6 months after our initial report, we went back to Liberia and met up again with Archie Besse.
We went through a lot of hell. Now today you come to West Point, it's not scary like the way it used to be. If you are not paying for the community volunteers, I can say to you that we have been more casualties, more death recorded.
At Redemption Hospital, we spoke to Dr. Mohammed Sanko, whose facility had been the epicenter of the outbreak in Monrovia.
Was the medical infrastructure here ready to deal with Ebola?
Never at all. Never at all. It requires training, how to approach the patient, how to manage the patient. If you don't have that one, it's a matter of just between life and death.
There was a lot of denial in the community in the beginning. Why is that?
Why? Because they never saw anything like that before. So the denial was high in Sierra Leone as well as in Guinea. In fact, especially more in Guinea, the denial. In such a way that they started even beating health workers. They say, you bring in Ebola, we don't know anything about Ebola. You are lying.
Distrust of government and foreigners in the region is nothing new. A history of foreign exploitation, as well as recent civil wars, corruption, and poor leadership, has left local populations hesitant to cooperate with their governments and NGOs. In Forcaria, we met up with Omami Barry, part of a UNICEF team in charge of breaking down resistance in remote parts of the country.
The first message we got, they were saying there is no vaccine, no medicine, which is true. But at the same time, you said, if you got the symptoms, come to us. So they thought that if you come to us, they will help you to die in order not to contaminate the other people.
Many locals told us the initial messaging about the outbreak was counterproductive and further fueled the resistance.
You guys weren't even allowed to come here up until a few weeks ago.
Yeah, right. It was very, very dangerous.
What are we looking at right here?
We are looking about the government office, which was destroyed by population, and they burn items.
It's easy to look at the situation and be really confused and think, how could they, fight against people trying to help them with this disease? But if you really look at it, you've got people telling you that a disease you never heard of exists. They're coming in these suits that look like spacemen. They're taking away your relatives. They're telling you you can't see them, you can't touch them. They disappear and you never see them again. And you've got to realize that no matter who you are, whether you're a villager in Guinea or anywhere else in the world, if that was going to happen, most people are going to be resistant towards that.
While spreading awareness is incredibly important, it hasn't been enough to contain the disease. The 3 countries struck the hardest by Ebola are deeply interconnected, with people regularly traveling back and forth between them.
So we've got people coming off right here. They're coming from Sierra Leone, where you have a lot of people who still have this disease. And they're being held right now until they can get a crew together to check their temperature, see if they show any symptoms, just to make sure that anyone that's coming off isn't infected. Because if they are, and they get loose in this community, you're gonna have a big problem here in Guinea.
In regions hit by Ebola, checkpoints like these are actually commonplace. And borders between countries have been closed intermittently. In a more extreme measure, Sierra Leone has made frequent use of quarantines.
Well, here in Sierra Leone, it is the hardest hit country by the current Ebola outbreak. Behind me, this orange netting is blocking off this community because the entire neighborhood is under quarantine.
These quarantines confine potentially infected people for up to 3 weeks. Because it can take up to 21 days for people with Ebola to show symptoms, it's believed that a new round of Ebola cases broke out in the Freetown neighborhood of Aberdeen after a fisherman returned with the infection.
How has it been inside the quarantine for 21 days?
It's not easy, but we did that for a reason, for our own health. I do not expect that Ebola will come here because they put all measures in place. They put bucket, you see bucket here, wash hands, everything. We abide to the rules. This is my wife. She's a survivor. She's suckling mother. She has a baby. They went to the hospital before the quarantine started. And then after 3 days, I got a result that she's also positive.
The baby got it from the breast milk?
Yes. And unfortunately, I lose her. Next day, they gave me this. That's this.
But as we would have learned, it's almost impossible to keep track of all those who are potentially infected. In fact, we got word that a man fled from Aberdeen to his hometown near McKinney, where the disease had been under control, to seek help from a traditional healer, so we went to see the consequences.
This morning we have buried 4. Now we'll carry another 3. So all is 7 for today.
We have now up to 29 for this week.
This is why Ebola is so dangerous. It only took one sick person to bring the disease raging back.
There's hundreds of bodies buried here in this Ebola cemetery. There's workers there right now that are digging more holes for more bodies. You know, we in America, we think this disease is over, but clearly it's still wreaking havoc here in this region. You may notice that there's no relatives here. Their relatives are all still quarantined, so there's no send-off, and it's just, you know, people in a plastic bag being thrown to the ground.
Things can change incredibly quickly with Ebola. The outbreak was winding down here at the Matinee Treatment Center near McKinney. But after the sick man from Freetown arrived, cases began to skyrocket.
How many patients do you have in the clinic right now?
Totally in the clinic, I think we've got upwards of 50 people.
And last week, you were the busiest treatment center in the history of the outbreak.
That's correct, yeah. The ambulances were queuing up to get into the place. We're now seeing the people that are going to recover. Their bodies are starting to fight back. They're now starting to regain their strength. And hopefully in the next few days, we're going to see them walking out of here.
And that's going to be a huge morale boost for you and for the people in the town as well, yeah?
Really important for us to get a survivor back out there to spread the message. That coming in here is not a death sentence, that we can help.
What we saw near McKinney was just a fraction of the devastation caused by the virus, which has so far claimed more than 10,000 lives in West Africa. This time, it didn't spread to the rest of the world, beyond a few high-profile cases.
The first confirmed case here in America.
We learned overnight that a second healthcare worker tested positive for the virus.
Former Ebola czar Ron Klain warns that the next epidemic could be a much bigger global threat, unless things change.
What did we learn through this epidemic?
The world wasn't prepared for this kind of outbreak when it happened. There was no prearranged group of responders ready to jump in quickly and deal with this kind of epidemic. We have to have that next time. We need to build CDC-like capacities in other countries around the world. We need to have trained epidemiologists on the ground ready to go. Ebola broke out in 3 relatively small countries that don't have that many travelers to the west. Imagine another epidemic someday in a country like India or Pakistan, where there are some major cities where the disease could spread rampantly. And imagine a disease in the future that might be airborne or might have people who are contagious without obvious symptoms. Those scenarios are the scenarios that are much more dangerous than Ebola, and compared to that, Ebola was much less dangerous than what might come next. We are either going to find, fight, and stop these diseases overseas, or we're going to face them here at home.